why don't we get started? Welcome. My name is Fritz Mayer. I'm director of POLIS Center here at the Sanford School. That's sponsoring the event, also co-sponsored by the Sanford School and by the Ethics and Society Certificate Program of the Keenan Institute of Ethics. So thanks for being here. Very timely topic. Not that long ago, it felt like democracy was on the march around the world. We had everything from the fall of the Berlin Wall, democratization in Russia, stirrings in China, the Arab Spring, and even before that, at least we imagined that the interventions were going to lead to a more democratic Middle East. There was a sense in which the arrow history was very much leading in the direction of liberal democracy. In fact, Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history because it was so inevitable. Well, that was then and this is now. Doesn't take much looking around to see that things have changed. Russia, very troubling events in China, reports about the mass incarceration of Uyghurs, etc. It's not confined to those places. In Europe, in Turkey, in Austria, in Hungary, and elsewhere. Events in Brazil. I don't have to go too far, and some would argue events in the United States as well, calling to question the future of democracy and the corollary, I suppose, the rise of authoritarianism apparently around the world. So that's the topic for tonight, and we have we couldn't have two better people really to talk about this issue. My role will be to moderate the discussion. So let me introduce them. Michael Abramowitz, who is the president of Freedom House. Freedom House is a watchdog organization. As you probably know, it's been in existence for quite a long time, since 1941. That really monitors the state of freedom and democracy around the world, issues very influential reports evaluating the state of freedom. Most recent Freedom in the World 2019 also focuses a lot on media freedoms as well. Michael, before becoming the president of Freedom House, directed the education efforts at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And before that was a very distinguished journalist for the Washington Post, and before that elsewhere, but national editor, White House correspondent at the Washington Post. So Michael, thanks so much for being here. And to my left, your right, someone who needs probably no introduction, Judith Kelley, who is the Dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy. Judith is a scholar of a number of topics relevant for tonight. She first book on ethnic politics in Europe, extensive writings on elections and election monitoring, and more recently a whole body of work including a book entitled Scorecard Diplomacy on the role of indices and as ways of modifying hopefully the behavior of states in the international arena. So both of you working, I can have an edited volume coming out on indices that which is very much pertinent to the topic today. So Judith, thank you for coming all the way upstairs from your office, which is just below us. So welcome. So what we'll do is I'll just start by asking a few questions, and then we'll just open up for conversation because I think there's plenty to talk about here. And what I thought we'd do is cover sort of like what is happening, why is it happening, and what can we do about it? So that's sort of the basic thrust of what I want to talk about. So let me start with you, Michael, in terms of the what is happening. You just issued the report, the Freedom House issued the report, I believe for the 13th consecutive year-by-year measures. Democracy is declining around the world. What's going on? What is happening?
Well, first of all, let me thank Dean Kelley and you, Fritz, for having me here at Duke. It's my first time here on this beautiful campus.
Welcome.
Had a nice walk around the campus, and thank you for the nice weather. Also, I noticed, by the way, that you also decided to invite Madeleine Albright this week too. So
Democracy.
That's right.
it says Democracy Week. I'm
It
guessing
is
that maybe the
democracy.
people of one time to hear about democracy are probably going to see Secretary Albright.
We have given you equal bill.
Okay. Let me ask you a question, but let me just first, if I may, just say a word or two about Freedom House.
Absolutely.
Because I think the story of Freedom House is very interesting and relevant to today. We are probably the oldest pro-democracy organization in the United States. We're founded in 1941. We were founded as a group that was opposed to isolationism and America First. That was the origin story of Freedom House. And I frequently talk about the story today because it seems so relevant. The idea that America First is, once again, a word that we are using in our own lifetime is very surprising to me, especially having been at the Holocaust Museum, where America First was associated with anti-Semitism and xenophobia. And so Freedom House was created to basically champion United States engagement in the European war. At the time, 90% of Americans did not think that, this is before Pearl Harbor, did not think that America should go to war in Europe to defend democracy. But Freedom House did. That was the origins of Freedom House. And the other thing I just would mention about our founding is that our founding patrons were Eleanor Roosevelt and also Wendell Willkie, who had run against Eleanor's husband in 1940 for president. So we had a Democrat and a Republican basically championing democracy, and that's always been in our DNA, that we've been focused on really non-partisanship, but getting voices across the aisle on behalf of these core freedoms that we believe in at Freedom House. At Freedom House, we do a couple different things. We do support for human rights activists and civil society around the world. We can talk about that if people here are interested. We also do advocacy in the U.S. Congress on public education about these issues. But as you indicated, Fritz, our flagship publication is Freedom in the World, which is a product that began in 1972. It's essentially a survey of every country in the world ranked in terms of how they respect core political rights and civil liberties. It's really an index project about political rights and civil liberties and rating every country in the world. Candidly, there are a number of other products that have grown up in the last number of years. I do think that we are probably the best known product, and I think the product that probably has the most salience with the larger public. We're John Oliver is a frequent consumer of our reports. He quotes us on his TV show, but Secretary Condoleezza Rice, Madeleine Albright, they often will quote Freedom House, and obviously people in the U.S. Congress as well, and academics maybe to a lesser extent. But we're very proud of the report. Essentially what we do is we look at 25 specific indicators of political rights and civil liberties. So this will range from things like the conduct of elections, the independent press, rule of law, to things like free expression, freedom of religion, and other core freedoms. And we have a complicated process, which I'm happy to describe later, but essentially we come up with a score for every country in the world on a scale of 0 to 100. And in general, just to give you some of the top line findings of our reports, not just this year's report, but going back 10 years, we are in the midst of what some have described as a democracy recession, that really from the period of the mid-70s to about 13 or 14 years ago, it was a so-called third wave of democracy. And you had the fall of the Berlin Wall, you had the collapse of military dictatorships in Latin America. You really had a substantial advance of democratic practice all over the globe. And I believe these are rough numbers correct. We had about 27% of countries went to 44% in terms of the number of free countries in the world. So we group countries, we rank countries on a scale of 0 to 100, and we group countries into 3 basic categories: free, partially free, not free. And as Fritz said in his opening remarks, this democracy recession has meant that for every year for the last 13 years, there have been more countries that have been declining in terms of their Freedom House scores, in terms of political rights and civil liberties, than those increasing. 2017 was actually much worse than 2018. We had about 70 countries that declined versus about 35 increasing. This year the gap is narrowed to about 68 declining, 50 falling. And it's led some, including Professor Larry Diamond at Stanford had an interesting commentary about it. He seemed to think that we might be beginning to turn things around. And you also had this year a number of very significant regional countries, including four in particular: Malaysia, Armenia, Ethiopia, and I'm blanking on the fourth one, but I'll come back. I'll report on it. But we had four countries. That, no. I'll tell you. I'll tell you. Let me look it up. I don't want to.
These are the ones that actually improved.
Yeah, we had four. Yeah, I don't always like to. Let me see. We had Armenia, in Malaysia, Ethiopia, and Angola. We had four countries that actually had 5-point increases in their scores, which is a lot for Freedom House. Having more than 1 or 2 point movement in either direction, hey Phil, is remarkable. And so we had, I think there's some signs that this democracy recession might actually be reaching its trough. But we'll see. We're not sure. We have some very significant countries. Nicaragua had a 12-point drop this year. Turkey has been on a downward trend significantly for 10 or 15 years, according to our scores. Hungary moved this year from being free to partly free. It's the first country in the EU that's ever been rated less than fully free, according to the Freedom House scores. So there's still a lot of significant countries that are doing poorly. One country, I'm not going to talk a lot about it now, but we're happy to talk about it in the questions that we focused on a lot this year, is the United States. The United States has been suffering a gradual erosion of, in our scores over the last 8 years. It's predated President Trump, so I try not to be partisan about it, but we can come back to the United States. We're concerned about where the United States ranks. It's gone from being a country in our scores that's been close to its democratic peers like Germany, England, France, and it's now below them. It has gone from a global score of 93 to a global score of 86 over the course of the last 8 years. A couple interesting findings which you could talk about further if interested. One is a very interesting phenomenon where in the early part of the democracy recession, you saw countries that were kind of bad countries, so to speak, bad countries in quotes, but countries like Russia, getting worse. And now you see democratic countries in the West, in Europe, and the United States decline. So of roughly 40 countries that are considered long-term democracies, at least half of them have had a decrease over the last 5 years.
That's good. Well, Turner, you did on the question of maybe particularly around election, but let me just follow very quickly in terms of, so what, maybe you could say just a few words about what you're looking for, like what are the elements of the index that you're highlighting, and maybe what are those things that in, say, Hungary or in the West that you're seeing declines in? Which of those indices?
What we're really looking at are core political rights and civil liberties. It's really not an index of economic freedom. I mean, there are other indices of that, but we're really looking, and I think what I would say is we are looking at what you might consider the core components of liberal democracy. So if the basic idea is in liberal democracy that the people have the right to choose their leaders, the crucial ingredient is elections. So one thing we're analyzing is whether the presence of having free and fair elections. But elections are not enough. You have to have a free press so you can hold the government to account. You have to have a rule of law so that the people in power can't throw their opponents into jail. So I would say that's what we're looking for. And so in a country like Hungary is an interesting example where There are elections in Hungary, but over the last 8 or 9 years, because of steps taken by the government to drive out media opposition, to kind of crack down on civil society, they have basically made the country what we would consider less free.
Well, you mentioned elections. Let me turn to Judith. And you've been studying elections around the world for a long time, and not just monitoring, but other ways of trying to improve elections. I don't know whether you are seeing the same trends, or you could comment on what's happening in that particular space, or other. You cover a lot of territory actually in the work that you're doing now on indices.
Yeah, so just some random thoughts. So yeah, first of all, also thank you for having me, and also I think Fritz is too modest because Fritz is also a scholar of international relations. So I think that you can jump in as well, Fritz, with your own thoughts on this. But speaking of elections, so I started studying election monitoring quite a while ago when it was really something that became popular in the late 80s, early 90s, and it came to the point where it was almost a self-declaration of cheating if you didn't invite monitors. So it became increasingly just uniformly present to have international election monitors. And it was a monitoring regime that was very fragmented, lots of international organizations and domestic organizations, regional organizations, etc. But I think what we've seen is that movement really crest, and I think it's becoming less important. And what's happened, I think, is that autocrats have figured out how to have the trappings of elections, and I think they're hiding behind that. And I think we focused on it a lot, sort of as the ticket to being declared free and fair and democratic, and so having a free and fair election becomes sort of the entry ticket into the society and club of democracies. And lo and behold, just as we were getting that down, everybody was figuring out how to game that, and how to game the monitoring systems as well by inviting a host of monitors that were then big amongst each other about the quality of the elections and that would spin it politically, etc. And so I think we're seeing a real de-emphasis now on monitors, more domestic monitors being present sort of overall, but it's ironic that just as we've seen the competencies of elections being promoted as sort of the hallmark of a democracy, that in advanced democracies, I think we're now starting to question truly whether elections can deliver the truth to us. How can we trust elections if we have misinformation in advance of elections that make it unclear whether the will of the people are truly reflected in elections, even in countries like our own. So I think that elections have come to represent a real enigma, and so it's something that we're grappling with, because if elections can't be counted on as a mechanism for thinking about the veracity of a democracy, then what can? And then how do you really ascertain the will of the people in an information society like the modern one that we have? So, so I would sort of say that on elections, if I could just cover a couple of other
Of course, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I was just going to say about your Freedom House's report, and as Fritz mentioned, I've been working on indices and ratings and rankings as a way of a tool that can be used by actors to influence whoever gets rated or ranked, just like we know we as universities jump, in response to the college ratings and how can we get ranked better, etc. Well, there's some of the same thing goes on with countries, but there's actually 2 PhD students that are part of a project that I'm working on right now, and they've done a study of the Freedom House report. And I don't know whether you've seen it. It's very clever. So what they look at is they look at countries that just barely they're right there between partly free, and then when they drop to unfree, that it's a continuum because there's an underlying scale that rates countries, And so some countries are going to be just barely above, and some are going to be just barely below in whether or not they fall to the unfree. But they get very different media coverage if they fall to the unfree. So they've taken advantage of this, and they look at the countries that just barely fall into the unfree, and they compare them with the countries that don't. And that's called a discontinuity design. And then they look at hostile statements by democracies towards these countries in the period after the report is released. And they find an increase in the hostile statements that democracies will make towards countries if they just fall under the, that they're not free. And they call now, that their paper is called the Scarlet Letter, so that the Freedom House report, not free, is a little bit like a scarlet letter to countries. So I just wanted to...
That's great. Did you know about this?
Yeah.
There's been a lot of people, usually, I always hesitate to come to college campuses to talk
Yeah,
about freedom house to get attacked on methodological grounds.
Yeah, no, but this is not the message.
No.
They just
But it doesn't surprise me. I actually think it's, I've thought about why does our report have such resonance? And I do think it's the fact that the person who created it in the first place, came up with this broad category of free, partly free, not free. It's just a very kind of bumper sticker way, and that's kind of what you're getting at.
Exactly.
At your point.
So I just wanted to mention that.
One point I would just, what your point about elections is very well taken. I was, I took the, I had the privilege this past summer of being on an election monitoring mission to Zimbabwe. Because I wanted to kind of get out of Washington. I wanted to kind of see how this is happening in Zimbabwe, obviously a very significant African country which had a lot of problems. It was very interesting because you really felt being there kind of what you're talking about, which is that the whole trappings of elections is very magisterial in some ways. Actually watching ordinary people, go to the polls, their fingers are dipped in purple ink so that they're not, double voting. And I think there's genuine excitement about the election, and the government itself very much wanted the elections, as you point out, to be a legitimizing feature for them. They wanted to get out of the international sanctions that have been placed on them because of the actions of the Mugabe during the Mugabe era. But we had to remind people, and I think our mission I was on part of the U.S. mission that was organized by the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute. There were about 20 different missions, including domestic monitors as well. But the point that we kept saying was, the election is not just what happens on election day. It's the 6 months leading up to the elections. And if in the 6 months leading, if one side controls the media space, if one side has taken steps to intimidate voters on the other side, if one side has made it hard for the opposition to actually mount serious campaigns, then you have to sort of question sometimes the results. And so I said, my own instinct was that election was probably freer and fair than past elections in Zimbabwe. I do think, but I think the idea that this was reflected the authentic voice of the people was something I wasn't quite sure.
Well, let me follow up on this point. You've now both made it. This question about the legitimacy of the election in the sense of it reflecting an informed voice of the people. Of course, there are these traditional problems of controlling the media, propaganda on one side, restricting, but we also have the phenomenon of social media, the internet. We were talking earlier about the ways in which there was, early on, a strong sense that the internet was this immensely democratizing force that enabled many people to have voice who didn't have it before, and that's true, and organizing, etc. But I'm curious, maybe both of you maybe comment on the extent to which the either traditional forms of propaganda or the sort of this new media, social media environment is making it more difficult to have an election that we can be confident represents the will of the people.
Well, Well, let me make 2 points. I think there's no question that it makes it much more hard to know in the current media environment. I mean, even in our own country, we had this situation with Facebook and with Russian, efforts to sow discord, and so the whole media environment. I don't know how we're going to get to a point where we address those issues. I will say one thing in defense of elections, and I think you saw that in our report this year. You had 2 very significant countries, Malaysia and Armenia, where there was either corrupt or authoritarian tendencies among the, and there actually were elections, and essentially the people did not like what was happening in the case of Malaysia, the widespread corruption, similar in Armenia, and they basically used elections to throw out the incumbent. And so I do think that Judith's point that it's become much more easy for autocrats to control elections. In fact, there's a whole book about this whole issue, how to rig an election, which is very interesting by some academics in England. But I do think at the end of the day, there's not a lot of alternatives to having elections, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to try to make them as free and fair as possible.
It's still better than not having an election.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that when you hit on the information environment, what's different is that we now have actors that are intentionally acting as what we now call black knights. So I've been studying democracy promotion for a long time, and we always thought that were just good actors in that space, people that were promoting democracy. And there's nothing new about, foreign powers meddling in the message, in the United States and Voice of America and on and on. But the difference is that we now have black knights, such as Russia, to some extent China, that are purposefully sowing misinformation, discord, exploiting divisions in society, specifically for the purpose of setting us up to be discontent about the democratic model. And so is that enabled by social media? Probably. Probably somewhat. But would they probably maybe have found another way? I don't know. I think it's more of it's the fact that these actors are out there that's really frightening and nervous.
And the point you're making about their intention is, on the one hand, maybe we put the thumb on the scale for one candidate or another, but the deeper motive appears to be to actually cause discord and delegitimize the democratic process.
That's right.
So that was actually something I would follow up with you in terms of what is happening. Although there's some differences of view, I think the majority view is that the polling data worldwide, at least in most regions of the world, suggests people are less confident in democracy than they used to. And so even in this country, that's the case. And so, I'm not sure exactly what's causing it, whether it's black knights or other factors, but how much is this something that keeps you up at night? You're thinking, this is the ultimate destabilization if we lose confidence in democracy as a form of government.
It actually does keep me up at night sometimes, because I think the institutions that we built are so crucial to our society, and so so I think that part is really scary. And what scares me more, though, is not so much the decrease in confidence of democracy as a model. I think people have always been discontent with how democracy works, but is the number of people who are willing to say that, yeah, they could probably live with something that was autocratic. Yeah, that could be okay. That's a death jolt. That's a jolt for me. The acceptance of the non-democratic model and the push for the non-democratic model, the China model, whatever. That people think that it's actually, as long as they can have the trappings of what the capitalist model produces, the benefits, because that's in many cases why they're disenchanted with democracy. It's not, in their views, delivered in a fair way the economic benefits. Then they're more content to actually to have a non-democratic form of government, and that I find really was
No.
there.
I think there are two issues that would be of concern, probably many more. And by the way, there have been about 100 books written in the last 2 years about this subject. So I'm a little bit humble about saying that this is the answer. I do think the fact that Russia, but also China, and I think China in some ways is probably a more significant country in the long term, but China is holding itself out as a alternative model to democracy. You know, essentially a dynamic capitalist country that is in an authoritarian setting. And in fact, I think President Xi, at one of the recent Communist Party, you know, convenings, basically said as much. And so, and I think that I find at Freedom House that one of the big challenges is really explaining the virtues of democracy to others. When people come to me, you know, I had some, you know, a minister from a big Asian country came to see me to complain about our scores one year. And that's what happens. That says to me that people are paying attention. But he said, you know, Mr. Abramowitz, you know, we here in Asia, you know, we see these things differently. We value stability. We value consensus. And so I think, you know, it's really, it becomes a harder case to make when you see the kind of economic dysfunction in some of parts of Western Europe or in our country. I think that's a challenge. Lost my other words.
Well, let me follow up just one last thing.
Yeah.
It really relates directly to China,
Yeah.
which is the Chinese appear to be at the absolute forefront of using information technology, facial recognition technology, a host of other technologies to monitor its citizens, to track who they meet with,
Yes.
and of course even at the extreme, obviously, to imprison and do harsher things. And I guess part of the worries is actually quite, I mean, that to me is extremely alarming as you begin to see the potential of these new emerging technologies to as instruments of control. Is that something that you're?
No, we're very much focused on that. In fact, one of our other major reports that we do is something called Freedom on the Net. And it's really a great report, which looks at essentially government efforts to, you know, to do what you said, to basically control the information space in their own countries. And what's interesting is, you know, back in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president, he kind of said, well, it was crazy for the Chinese to think that they could control the internet. It'd be like trying to, you know, nail Jello to a wall. Well, it turned out he was completely wrong. You know, they've built this incredible system of repression, this so-called Great China Firewall, with hundreds of thousands of sensors, and basically keeping information out very effectively from the citizens of China.
And information about them.
And then what's also interesting, and this is a theme of our most recent report in November, is what we're calling the export of digital authoritarianism. So China is basically going to other countries and offering trainings in their surveillance techniques, offering to sell them their tools that they use in this kind of censorship regime. So this is an example of China kind of holding itself as a model, not just in theory, but actually, you know, trying to promote alternative approaches to the internet.
Yeah. You must have, you spent some time in China at a time when the nascent democracy movement was probably at its peak in China, and now you must have an interesting perspective on sort of what has happened since.
Well, I was just thinking Mike, when you were talking about this, because I was in China in the late 80s, the year before and after the Tiananmen massacre, and I often thought in retrospect that their big disadvantage at the time was that they didn't have social media, they didn't have a way of communicating, so they would actually have to get on a train with their posters and glue them up in the next city over, and when Nippon declared martial law, they had a difficult time because there were protests in every city square in all the big provincial capitals, but they had a hard time coordinating on a response. And so had they had social media then, it could have been a force for good. But I was thinking as you were talking in terms of China and the whole monitoring scheme, that again, this is nothing new. This has been in the DNA of the communist system in China for as long as I can remember. And when I lived there in the late 80s, they just had to scale it up and execute it in a different way as people have moved to the big cities and things have gotten scaled up. But it used to be that, you know, a person belonged to a unit, and somebody was always standing at the entrance to that unit and watched when everybody came and went. There was never any uncertainty about where you were, what you were doing. The government has always known all these things in China and kept complete track of them. Now they've just found a high-tech way of doing it as that society has become more complex and people have gained more freedom of movement.
By the way, I do remember the one other point I was going to add.
Yeah,
Because I was thinking about Judith's point about staying awake at night and worried about democracy. I mean, I tend to be optimistic, and I do think if you look at the long stretch of like the last 100 years, we have to remind ourselves that there are many more democracies now than existed at the end of World War II and at the end of World War I. So I do think, but I think the one issue, and I don't have an answer for this, but that I do think about is we've always assumed that democracy is like a one-way street, that democratization, once you get there, then you're set. And I think what's interesting about the current situation, I think Hungary is a good example, is, you know, can essentially be backslide. And, you know, will countries that, you know, have reached this democratic nirvana, you know, backslide? And I think, you know, we just sort of assumed, as you said, with the end of history and the progress that had been made in Eastern Europe, in Poland and in Hungary in particular, but other countries as well, that democracy was a deeply rooted thing. And what it suggests in Hungary is maybe not.
Yeah, well, you know, you're back in the Holocaust Museum. I spent some time there actually. That's on Friday, and I hate the, you know, improper comparisons to the Nazi era. Nonetheless, I mean, you have a classic example of extreme backsliding. Highly, you know, very popular leader, quite elect, you know, you know, we see in that's the extreme case, but it's not the only one where we've seen populists, either the right or the left, I guess, historically overthrow democracies and install authoritarian government. Let me turn quickly. I want to open for questions because you see I'm finding this completely fascinating, so we'll monopolize the conversation. So I want to open it up for questions, but let me push you just a little bit to address the kind of why question, which is, you know, the nuances, it's complicated in the long sweep of history. Yes, we're better off than we've been at other moments. Nonetheless, I think there are a number of worrisome things out there. I'm just curious from where you sit as to what you see as the driving factors in that. So I suspect that'll help us understand or think about ways we might attack this as well. But what do you see? I'll start with you, Michael. What do you see as the things that are driving, at least the things that are keeping us up at night?
I think depending on who you talk to, they're going to emphasize different things. But I think about 3 or 4, you know, larger trends over the last 15 years. I start with the economic dislocations since the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, which I think helped create an opening for populist leaders to exploit, in different forms in different countries. You know, but we have our own phenomena here in the United States, but also in places like Hungary and Poland and other countries. So I think economics are one issue. I think sort of related to that is the global migration crisis. You know, we have the largest number of refugees in the world, you know, since the end of the World War II, and that is creating huge pressures on the system in the countries we're talking about. I think something we've already talked about is the kind of more aggressive role of China and Russia to try to make exporting authoritarianism a developing trend to go along with to counter democracy promotion. So that's a third issue that I would focus. And I think the fourth issue is clearly technology. And as you said, the internet, once seen as like a liberating technology, is now a tool that can be exploited by black actors. And so I think those are 4 issues that I would put on the table.
Well, that's pretty sweeping set. Judith, you see
I'll
other
just add
things
my
you want to
own
elaborate on? Yeah, yeah.
No, I mean, those are clearly the 4 ones. I would say that the migrant flows combined with the economic recession that hasn't distributed goods fairly, and shall I say, distributed jobs fairly, because although unemployment is low, I think people are not having good jobs. They're not having fulfilling jobs. They're having to work multiple jobs. And so I think all that plays into an us versus them identity politics that can so easily be exploited. I would add only one piece, which is that as part of the democratic waves that we had, and after the whole rise of human rights regime globally and the rise of democracy, we also had this building of an international liberal order. And along with that came all these international organizations that we saw as working for the good of the people. And I think that those organizations have now come to be perceived as very elitist and not be looking out, like the WTO, etc., not looking out for the interest of the common man. So I think that the failure has not just been like domestic, that we haven't distributed goods, but it's the whole global order has been set up in a way to favor those who have and have them get more. And so this extreme inequality too, I think, is important, because if you look at the baseline, it's not just that the democracy haven't delivered goods or economic well-being to people. In general, a lot of people are better off, even if real incomes haven't risen. You can now, you can buy a computer today, and you couldn't buy it 20 years ago. And so, in terms of what your actual goods that you have, but it's the inequality that has really driven this discontent, and that plays into identity politics. And then you got people ready to exploit that. And then you got whole regimes out there whose power rests on their ability to exploit it and are willing to feed it with algorithms. And it's just a deadly cocktail.
Well, that's sobering. Let me ask one, on the positive side, there are a lot of things we could talk about in terms of, that diagnosis, where do you intervene, how do you make things better? But both of you have been involved with effort to create indices, as a way of pushing back on certain aspects of this. What's the sort of theory of change there? How does we've talked a little bit in passing here about sort of how that works, but what is the premise that the reports that you issue? How is that, in your mind, an instrument to help improve matters?
Well, I can give you a concrete, very human effort. I was in Prague in the fall, and a young man came up to me from Congo Brazzaville. He was a human rights activist. He must have been in 25. And he said, "You work at Freedom House. I use your scores to lobby my government to improve political rights and freedom." And that was so moving to me. I mean, so I do know, and the fact that the foreign minister of Ukraine came to me a week after I was took over at Freedom House and was complaining about something in our scores.
Yeah.
It says to me that people, as Judith, as a case of your colleague suggests, countries do care and pay attention to these scores, and it's a useful tool for advocates to use in making the case for change. Now, obviously, there's certain countries that don't care about it at all. And it's interesting, we talk about Hungary, and Hungary's reaction to our report, moving from free to not free. They said, well, they're just they're just part of the, they're just part of the Soros. Of course, sadly, we haven't had any money from Soros too.
At least you could have gotten some money if you're going to get.
We're going to get blamed for it, but they never deal with the actual, with the actual merits of our argument. And so, but a lot of countries do care about it. I think those countries that are sort of hovering, between free and partially free or between not free and partially free are the ones that pay a lot of attention to these scores.
And that's what you found, that people, that there is some force to these.
Oh, absolutely, and it's a dangerous question because I could go on for hours and hours about the actual mechanisms of how it works and why it works and when it works.
I've just 30-second version.
Yeah, I've just written another paper about the Wellbeing Ease of Doing Business Index, and you can just trace the effects on business-related regulations in countries. But you know, two points about it. One is the fact that it's iterative. So it's not just coming out and shaming countries, but they know that there's another one coming out, and it keeps coming out. And so it's not just we ride out this wave of having been called out until it dies down. But you know, it's coming back again, and it's coming, and it's comparative. The comparative factor is really important, as opposed to the EU, say, issuing some kind of démarche and saying, you bad country. No, this is like, okay, Cuba is in this category, and Brazil is in that category, and that matters. And then my work really talks about three channels that it works through. One is the domestic mobilization channel, one is the transnational pressure, and then one is an elite bureaucratization, so directly engaged with elites, the effect it has on them. But I won't go into all of that. If you're more interested in that, we can have a separate talk on that. But I'll just make one last point before you open it up, Fritz, to questions which we haven't talked a lot about, which is the whole democracy promotion industry. And where is that now? Because that's what I've been, you know, overall I've been studying for all these years. And I think it's interesting to note that as the wave and the recession that we now start to call a recession really started, it really coincides with a decrease in democracy promotion efforts. I'm not saying that's causal, but it's very interesting to be aware of the disinvestment in democracy promotion. And I think we tend to you know, just pin on certain things on certain administrations, but this clearly is something that goes back to the middle of the Obama administration. Yes. Obama was very weary of promoting democracy per se after it had gotten associated with invasions in Iraq and Afghanistan, sort of the imposition of regime change, and there was a real backpedaling of softer methods, etc., and disinvestment, and so I think that that's an interesting thing, that oftentimes we have disinvested ourselves in democracy promotion and taken on much tamer versions of democracy promotion, like, you know, quotas for women in parliament, which is a good thing, you know, but it's not the same as democracy, etc. And again, this allows people ways of complying with the trappings without really having any fundamental.
Well, that's very interesting, and it does suggest the corollary would be that if you invested more in this, you might actually have.
Well, part of the problem is not just an investment, it's that countries have conflicts of interest all the time, right? And so they want to promote democracy, but they also want stability.
Yeah,
and so democracy promotion tends to lose out. But there are a number of countries in which we actually don't have conflicts of interest, and where we could at least be more consistent.
Well, as you can see, we can carry on amongst ourselves forever. So, but I'll stop that, resist that temptation. Let's open up the floor to any and all questions. So,
so I wonder if you can talk a bit more about Freedom House and the United States. I mean, you tantalizingly skipped over the notion that there has been an 8-year trend line, and it sounds like a pretty negative trend line. So, can you talk about the factors?
Yes. First of all, let me just say as a point of context, we've always looked at the United States as part of our analysis. So every time we do a report, we don't just analyze what's happening in Russia or Turkey, but we look at the United States. In fact, about 10 years ago, we did a whole book-length study called Americans How Free that really tried to zero in on this for the United States. So I think that's something I'm very proud of at Freedom House, that we always do. But as I indicated, what we've seen over the last 8 or 9 years is the United States moving from a global score of 93 on a scale of 0 to 100 to 86. That's taken place slowly over 8 years. It took place during the Obama administration. We marked, and by the way, again, I just feel like I need to say this, our scores are not a rating of governments per se. It's an analysis of the levels of freedom that people experience inside a country. Obviously, a government can influence that, but there are other factors that can influence that. So I just felt like I wanted to say that. But over the course of the last 8 years, we've marked the United States down in a couple of areas. I think kind of legislative dysfunction was an area that we've expressed concern about. Also, during the Obama administration, we were quite critical of the administration's efforts to go after leakers and to kind of prosecute whistleblowers, and mark the United States down in that area. And then starting in 2016, well, actually, there's been in the first year of Trump, there was a 3-point drop, and that was associated with 3 specific things. One was we have a whole category about safeguards for against transparency, safeguards against corruption, and we felt we marked the U.S. down in that. We marked the U.S. down in the context of elections because of the Russian interference in the election and the failure of the United States to take action to prevent that from happening in the future. And there was one other area.
What about gerrymandering?
Gerrymandering is an issue that we've done in the past,
right,
too. And by the way, that's a global phenomenon.
Sure.
It's not just the United States. That's a factor in Hungary in particular. So this year, actually, the United States did not have the U.S. stayed the same at 86. And I think that's because we had kind of captured some of the previous problems.
What does 86 put us on? What's the company we keep now, as opposed to we were with almost with the Scandinavians, right? We're almost almost
40,
with a day.
We're about 45, 40. Yeah, the Scandinavians are always the best.
Yeah.
That's why I study indices, because we're always, Denmark's always up there at the top. So
So that, you can go look at our rating. There's some other. We're still very much in the free category, but we are. I think there are about 45 other countries that are ahead of us now.
That's great. Yeah. Yes.
Among the factors that both of you mentioned about the setbacks of the freedom and democracy in the world, what do you think is the role of a backlash of the conservatives towards the progress that was made in the last 10 years or so? In particular, for example, in this country, Obama administration, you mentioned the leak problems, yes, granted. But in terms of laws that were passed, both federal laws and state laws, in areas like same-sex marriage, for example, things like that, they have caused a lot of resentment among the more traditional segments of the society, which may have actually contributed to the results of the last presidential elections and many state elections as well. What do you guys think? Would you include that, the backlash, as a factor in the setbacks for the freedom and democracy both here and abroad?
I don't know that I would, because again, I think, yes, there's been gains in some of these areas, but if you take an issue like abortion, for example, and that's been so hotly contested, and there have been sectors of society that have felt very passionate about that for decades, and yet it's more like a fertile ground thing, that these things now are able to be played out or exploited in the context, especially with the Supreme Court nomination on the as part of the election package. But in and of themselves, I think that those kinds of very contentious issues have been part of the mix for a long time.
I do wonder if in this country and elsewhere, in part because of the immigration pressures in places like Hungary, elsewhere, in the U.S. as well, immigration, and the sort of generalized anxiety about demographic changes haven't contributed to a kind of identity politics that has been exploited by leaders in this country and elsewhere around the world. And you see the rise of nationalism, which is a corollary often to authoritarianism around the country, in part as a reassertion of some kind of ethnic identity in many places. The U.S. is more complicated, but still, even there's certainly overtones of that as well. So I think that at least as I'm thinking about it, in that sense, that there's been a heightened salience of identity politics, identity issues in this country and many others that to me at least is part of what's going on. It's being exploited by more nationalistic authoritarian leaders, often with a kind of a restoration narrative. We're sort of going back to where we've lost something, where our national identity is at threat, who we are is at threat, and so that immense appeal is maybe baked into the human psyche of the restoration narrative of going back to something that was purer, simpler, saner, romanticized past kind of thing is certainly in the air in this country, and I suspect as well in what I hear in some of these other places. I don't know, does that make sense to you, Monica?
I think it does. I mean, I think a point that I would like to make is that, in some ways, and we pointed this out not this year but last year, the election of Donald Trump was in some ways a reflection of democracy being very robust. The fact that this kind of guy came from sort of nowhere and kind of broke through kind of this duopoly and essentially and became president is a sign in some ways of the kind of vitality of democracy. I think just remember, Freedom House's scores were rating political rights and civil liberties, and really the core components of liberal democracy. And so I think what we've seen in the past in other kind of similar situations is a move to restrict those rights and freedoms. And so that's what our concern would be in any of these situations. But in some ways, it's a sign of vitality that someone like Donald Trump comes in.
Possibly, although it depends. It depends what happens. It can be very popular to restrict the. You've seen polls where when given the Bill of Rights, people wouldn't vote for it.
I would make that same point. But yes, I agree with that.
Can we, let's building on this whole question of immigration and migration. Wondering if, to some extent, liberal democracy, with this particular challenge, has some of its aspects are creating its own demise in a way. In that, classic liberal economic theory would say labor should go to where it's most efficiently used. Liberalism is about rights, human rights that transcend national boundaries, and because you're human, and we've attached rights to non-citizens essentially to petition for asylum, gain access to the countries through refugee policies, and so on. I'm not familiar with Freedom House's scores, but I don't know if you calculate in rights of immigration and things like that. And that, I feel like, when we have a mass immigration crisis caused by economic dislocation, now being caused by climate change and technology enabling people to pick up and leave and try to go somewhere much more, to save liberalism, to maybe you need more restrictive policies that trim back on some of those elements of democracy. And I wonder if you kind of see that same circularity at all, and is it possible to become more securely democratic by maybe trimming down on some of those rights?
Well, I don't know about restricting rights, but I do think...
I don't know about restricting rights, but I mean, crafting an immigration policy that is a little less, I don't know.
I agree with you, David, that and this is not an original point to me, but I do feel that if the United States were able to craft, and other Western countries were able to craft sort of much more workable compromises around immigration, that it could take the wind out of the sails of some of this kind of that's fueling the populist surge that we're talking about. I mean, if we, and by the way, they tried to do this under Bush, where they tried to have a deal essentially of more security for a path to legal status for 11 million. That strikes me still as a deal that would be worth pursuing if I were a public policy person, because I think if there were that kind of deal, I think that would be one of the most powerful things that would kind of help stem this surge that we're talking about, this populist surge. That's just a personal feeling.
I think it's interesting if you compare Europe and the United States, because in most of the Western European countries, there have been very reasonable immigration policies in place, and you can't just, and you never were sort of just able to sneak across the border and then get a fake ID and work for years in the country. In Denmark, you can't function at all by sneaking across the border and living in some kind of subculture where you're not have an identity, because you can't even open a bank account unless you can prove that you are legal in. You cannot function in the country. You can't put your kid in school. I mean, you just can't function. So
that would be considered a huge violation of civil rights.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but what's really though punctured that has not been that. So it's not that the immigration rules were weak and needed to be tightened. It was the refugee stuff. It was the refugee crisis and those flows that, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with this just mass rush on countries, be they economic refugees, but so not just economic migrants, but truly fleeing, like otherwise I can't feed my family economically, and so that's really what put the pressure on Europe, not that they had lax immigration rules that need to be tightened. Yeah.
One of the paradoxes of the moment, of course, is that notwithstanding the president's rhetoric, we have less of a crisis today in terms of a mass flood of people going. I mean, the numbers are way down in terms of immigrants into this, seeking entrance in the United States, although they were, by historic record, they were quite high for a period of time. So maybe there's just a lag on these things.
One thing that's interesting, in some of the countries where we've seen steep score declines, and I'm thinking about Hungary and Poland, where the ruling party have made headway over immigration issues. There's not really an immigration problem in Hungary. It's not one of the countries in Europe that is being overrun by. It's not like Germany, which has took 1 million Syrian refugees. So part of it is not just the reality, but the way that certain people are able to exploit the fear of the other.
Right, because in Hungary it was almost like we're just going to build a wall around ourselves. And so they even was exploiting it, even as people didn't even want to stay there, but yeah.
Did you have a question?
Yes, in this discussion and others we've had recently, my good friends the Indians never seem to come up. We talk about China, we talk about Russia. What about the Indians? What are they doing for us? I'm positive towards them. I hope they're positive towards us.
You talking about India?
India.
Well, I mean, I know India is, I think, not acting as a black knight in the international system, struggling with mostly just the logistics of democracy. I don't know if you want to speak a bit more.
It's a strong democracy. I mean, I think they've been having some trouble managing internal ethnic issues. That's been their whole career.
Pretty much.
Well,
you do have the rise of a more intense Hindi nationalist figure in Modi, and it's probably too glib to sort of say he's of a kind with what's happening in Brazil or elsewhere. Yet it is there's some sense in which he's a little more nationalistic and more driven by a kind of identity politics than we've seen before. I'm no expert on India, but it strikes me from a great distance as the most immensely complex experiment in democracy you could even imagine constructing. Yes, question here.
You mentioned legislative dysfunction as one sort of criteria that you use in constructing your indices. I was just wondering, where do you rate bureaucratic dysfunction? Specifically here, I'm talking about what seems to be an increasing trend of blaming or calling out a deep state and attacking. It's not so much within branches of, or between branches of government, it's within branches of government that you get these sort of purges of groups either judged disloyal to the executive usually. I'm thinking here of Turkey with a purge after the attempted coup, but also the United States, where you have this sort of dueling screens of intelligence heads going on Capitol Hill and saying one thing, and then the president saying they should go back to school, and then repeated in the United States, repeated sort of appeals to purging, a deep state purging bureaucrats of, effectively, I mean, a form of freedom to sort of speak different or dissonant points of view in a bureaucratic sort of setting.
We've not, that's an interesting point. We have looked at kind of more, one of the issues we look at is, whether, the actions of the executive branch, reflect, the sort of the will of the electorate or the will of the, but I can't answer that. We've never, in my experience, I'm not aware of where we've marked down a government for what you're saying there. Perhaps that's something we might want to look at, but not to my knowledge.
It's an interesting space because a strong bureaucracy isn't necessarily the first thing you think of when you think of democracy. So, on the other hand, assaults on public service as a calling is a form of delegitimizing
Or
public
assaults
government.
on the media as well.
Yes.
Well, and assaults on the media, you do focus on.
Yeah, no, we do. I mean, that's an interesting one. I'm a former journalist, so it's something I think about a lot. And I think one thing I've had to kind of get my head around a little bit is thinking about press freedom in maybe a slightly different way, because you traditionally think about press freedom as just the ability of newspapers to report whatever they want and not to be censored. They're just kind of traditional measures of press freedom. But now you've got a situation in which in certain countries you can have a government that uses economic means to drive out opposition newspapers, opposition voices. They can still, if they existed, say what they want. But if they don't exist anymore, what's the, what's the implications for freedom? So,
and the extent to which, and I don't want to overstate it, but the extent to which you begin to inoculate the public against the media by calling fake news or by other things that attempts to delegitimize the press.
yeah, well,
Even
by the
if
way,
they're free to do their jobs, they're no longer credible with a portion of the electorate.
and I do think, it's kind of interesting, I do think that that in some ways we have a very resilient democracy, and on global standards, the United States press is very, very free. And we've not marked the U.S. down in terms of press freedom, but what happens here, people do pay attention to it elsewhere. What was interesting, in our Internet Freedom Report, we found about a quarter of the countries that we surveyed had actually passed laws restricting the rights of bloggers, restricting certain freedoms on the press, on the internet, in the name of combating fake news. Like, why is that suddenly something that they're wanting to combat? I mean,
Well, that's
Right,
very
but they're legitimate questions, right? Because if you sort of look at something like Facebook, what is the regulation that is needed to actually, is regulation needed to actually keep that space a fair space?
yes.
And the answer is probably yes. That there are needs to patrol that area in such a way that is not purposely misused by bad actors. So then that just raises this conundrum then.
Let's take a couple more, then we're here, and then Phil.
So I was wondering, going back to legislative dysfunction, the extent to which you think it can be both a bug and a feature in terms of protecting democracy, where I think the beginning definitely has some bad effects, but to what extent, like, the fact that the federal government has been so dysfunctional has sort of stopped, has sort of leveled off the decline?
It's a good question. I mean, I do think that the idea of checks and balances, is crucial to American democracy, but it's also crucial if you look at the way we think about what's happening in other countries. The trend of these authoritarian countries is they want sort of untrammeled executive power that kind of, and they've kind of systematically. We did a very interesting report 2 years ago about the tactics of modern authoritarians, and they don't kill people now, but they systematically try to go after any institution that can check their power, be that the legislative branch, the judicial branch, civil society, the media, the judiciary. So I think that, I guess what you're saying a little bit is that legislative dysfunction could be a way of kind of checking the worst impulses of an executive. But I think what we found is that I suppose that's true, but I would say that the more appropriate way of checking executive power is for the Congress to do oversight, or to pass laws that if they disagree with what the executive is doing, checks in that way, not by being dysfunctional.
There's perhaps a silver lining in that. We do see maybe more action at the state and local level now. So, for example, on climate change issue, you see states now saying, well, in our state, we're not going to take matters into our own hand, and we're going to do this. So you still see democracy working in that way. I think it's
And
positive.
even at the city level, remarkably.